I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Education here at the Hammer Museum. And I'm pleased to introduce tonight's program on the state of the state, which is to say the state of California and the future of the California Constitution. The Hammer Forum is a series of public discussions about current political and social issues, and it's made possible with the very generous support of Andy and Branya Galef. Tonight's distinguished guests are two of the ultimate insiders. We have former California Assemblyman Robert Hertzberg and journalist Dan Walters of the Sacramento Bee. And our moderator is Ian Masters. Ian is a BBC-trained broadcast journalist who has covered national security affairs for over 25 years on public radio. He's the host of Background Briefing, which can be heard on Sundays from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. And he just told me a moment ago he's now has a daily show at 5 p.m. on KPFK. Ian has been a senior fellow at UCLA's Center for Strategic and International Studies and the UCLA Center for International Relations, and he was a consultant to the Center for National Security Studies at Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. So please join me in welcoming Ian Masters.
See you in a bit. Thank you, Claudia, and all of you California dreamers for coming here tonight to hear about what a nightmare your state government has become. In a recent speech to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Cambridge, Massachusetts, California's Chief Justice Ronald George lamented that Sacramento has been placed in a fiscal straitjacket by the two-thirds majority needed to raise revenues, a restriction often at cross purposes with voter-approved initiatives to spend more on transportation and schools, etc. This constant meddling with the Constitution, George argues, has rendered our state government dysfunctional, at least in times of severe economic decline. He goes on to identify the voter initiative process, a product of the populist movement of the early 20th century, as having now become the tool of the very types of special interests it was intended to control, pointing out that while the United States Constitution has been amended only 17 times in addition to the Bill of Rights, the California Constitution has been amended over 500 times since 1879. Instead of the high bar of a two-thirds majority in both the U.S. Senate and House, with three-quarters of the states ratifying it, a constitutional amendment in California only takes just enough voters to eke out a majority and money, reminding us what a Californian politician famously said, that money is the mother's milk of politics. Well, welcome to the Sacramento Milk Bar, where milk is not all that is shaken down, where, as we have recently learned from an open mic, legislators can get a full-service spanking with a happy ending from married female lobbyists working for large energy companies. Thanks to voter-approved term limits, state senators and assemblymen and women barely learn the ropes before they are termed out, and in a bitterly ironic parody of the will of the people, the resulting vacuum of expertise and experience is filled by the permanent fixture of lobbyists and political consultants who enable special interests to thrive at the expense of the public good. Whether it was from inexperience or gullibility, Kenny Boyle of Enron and other lobbyists were able to beguile the Sacramento legislators to deregulate the energy market in California. Then, as Dick Cheney was meeting with his secret energy task force, they gamed the new market, siphoning from the state as much as $30 billion, while Governor Gray Davis twisted in the wind, trying to get the federal regulators selected by Ken Lay and appointed by George Bush to return his phone calls. The victims of a political mugging, Gray Davis was then punished for his perceived weakness, and in another distortion of Upton Sinclair's populist intentions, a right-wing funded recall election anointed a motion picture action hero to clean up Dodge. But in Act 1, the Terminator went an initiative too far in trying to grab power. Then in Act 2, he backed out of a fight with the nurses and firemen and reconciled with Gridlock, then stared bankruptcy in the face and started issuing IOUs. And now in Act 3, he has had to recall his bluff and drop his veto threats to get anything done. But this unhappy ending to a bad movie does have a message. We are left with the mystery as to why our predominantly democratic state has been run by a Republican minority along with Republican governors for decades. Having whipped up populist fervor to pass Proposition 13, 3 strikes, term limits, etc., they've saddled the state with bad laws, cemented their social engineering with fiscal booby traps, and turned the nation's leader in education into a gold-plated prison industrial complex where instead of educating our youth, we jail them. Having given politics a bad name, now our legislators feel the heat. They have formed a 20-member committee on improving state government. Tonight, we will first hear from a recovering politician, the former Speaker of the Assembly, who is co-chair of a bipartisan movement charged with dismantling the dysfunction. Robert Hertzberg will speak for about 15 minutes, followed by Dan Walters, who is familiar with the other reform movement advocating a constitutional convention. And then we'll have a discussion before extensive Q&A from you, our audience of angry Californian voters. Robert M. Hertzberg is a partner at Meyer Brown LLP. He previously served as California State Assemblyman representing the 40th District from 1996 to 2002 and was Speaker of the California State Assembly from 2000 to 2002. He chaired the transition team for Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa and served on the transition team for Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. He is a founding member of the Leadership Council of the Public Policy Institute of California and is co-chair of California Forward. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Hertzberg.
Holy moly, I've heard explanations of California, but that one's tough, let me tell you. Maybe accurate, but certainly tough. Look, you know, Chief Justice George was right about the initiatives, and I think in a lot of the observations you made are correct about California. But Time Magazine this week has reversed its position that it had from its November 18th, 1991 edition announcing the death of the California dream and says maybe it isn't so bad. Now, maybe that's a little puffery with the big picture of Arnold, if you've seen it, at the beach in California. But the truth is, you know, we in government tend to have our nose up against the glass a little much. And if you ask questions like, you know, what's the art world look like in California, or innovation in biotech, or what's happening in so many other areas of what makes California great. I mean, one of the things that's fun to poke fun at, like The Economist did some weeks ago about California, is because I guess if you wrote about Mississippi, no one would buy the magazine. You know, I have spent the last number of years after leaving government traveling the world working in a renewable energy business, probably traveling to more than 80 countries. And no matter where you go, everybody knows about California. Everybody knows about the dream, the Disneyland of California. And if you look around the world and you look at the remittatures of folks from all corners of the planet, whether they come from Pakistan or Mexico or the former Soviet, Czech Republic or whatever, of sending money home, it's because the best and the brightest from around the world want to be part of this dream. And so I would argue, yes, we're in big problems, and yes, there's a great deal of unintended consequences from earlier reform movements, whether they were 30 years ago or 100 years ago in California. But the challenge of a democracy is to figure it out, fix it, or get out of the way. Every generation we're charged with the new challenges. And when you look at what we're faced with, where we want high wages and health care and all of this great stuff, when you face other parts of the world and globalization, how do you achieve those ends, right? Let's just step back and look at the big picture. I was in Dongguan last year for 3 months, and people are saying, what do you do in business here when we're paying $200 a month for an employee in a factory when you can get the same employee of equal quality work in Vietnam for $100 a month? I mean, those are the challenges that you face, and the world has changed. The BlackBerries that we all use didn't exist 10 years ago. Google was only incorporated September 28, 1998. Now it's part of our vocabulary and our daily activity. So the dynamics in all of our businesses and our lives, practice medicine today or journalism, look what's happened to, you know, they don't use newspapers anymore hardly in the business. It's all electronic paper. It's changed, right? I mean, I'll bet you more people read you in electronic version, Dan, than do in paper version. So those dynamics have changed, and California has been on the forefront in so many ways. We have, and one of the great challenges of innovation is failure. You know, I went out and started a solar company in Cardiff, Wales. I'd never been to Cardiff, Wales before. But you know, look, it's risk. It's getting out there, and sometimes you win big, and they write the great stories about you, and when you lose, no one does, but you get in the game, you know? And we do that in California. So the challenge is, look, we've got some very different dynamics, and I would argue at the foundation of it is just the mere size of California. States were not intended to be the size of the eastern seaboard. If you look at, what is it, 1,250 miles or something like that, Dan, of the state, if you look at that and you compare it to the eastern seaboard, it goes from about the top of Florida to Connecticut. How many states are there? How many governors? How many U.S. senators? What's the commonality between Crescent City and Calexico? How do you manage that? How do you have state representatives where the average state representative around the country is 25,000 people or so? Dan was just telling me he was in Montana and walked and ran into the governor in the hallway, right? I mean, there are different dynamics. There's less people in Montana than there probably were in my assembly district. But how do you represent 1 million people? How do you have a dynamic democracy? And let me add one other dimension, because I want to frame it out. I know you guys have asked a lot of questions. And that is, at the same time, we're faced with this extraordinary rapid change that totally undermines folks' confidence. On the other side, we're trying to change our democracy and celebrate it. We talk about this great democracy that was formed in this Constitution adopted in 1787, but only white Protestant men who own land participated. We want a democracy that has a whole host of folks. Now, it's not working very well because in this city council district that I live in, I think about 7 people turned out for the last election, but we do try to engage in that. So with that framework, it's important to understand that our generation has a different set of challenges. I was there with a labor leader yesterday, meeting with her in Los Angeles and saying, you know, we used to be the rabble-rousers, now we're the establishment. We got the responsibility to figure it out. And that's where California Forward comes in. What happened was a number of the respected foundations around California said, you know, we're trying to fix foster care, we're trying to do something in health care or education or whatever, and the state is up and down and falling apart. Let's step back and see if we can try to fix the big picture. It's a huge lift. I had lunch with Dan some months ago, and I said, Dan, am I nuts? Am I wasting my time? He says, no, you got to try. Gives me a lot of confidence that someone who's been around for that many years says you got to try. And so what we're doing at California Forward is we're trying to step back. We're looking at, we've been to 45 of the 58 counties talking to folks. We have looked at every report, dusted off every report, Bob Stern's report on the budget, on financing of campaigns and all sorts of things, and said, how do we fix the place? And because you just, in this political environment, it's very difficult to have gigantic ideas. I think for those who followed Jerry Parsky's and others' endeavors with trying to change Texas, it was too big to digest too quickly. So how do you come up with something that the public will digest, that will stop the wars? I was talking to Dan in the green room before this. There's 59 initiatives that have been filed at the Attorney General's office for folks that either want to engage in the thermonuclear war or protect their little piece of cheese or whatever happens through the initiative process. I predict it'll be 70 in the next 10 days because I know of at least 5 more that are coming out. How do you figure it out? How do you take a thoughtful step moving forward in order to build toward responsibility? And really the most important point is to build toward a vision of what California is about. You can't sit and put your finger to the wind and say, I'm going to try to get everybody together and produce a vanilla solution so we stop a war. You got to have a point of view. And so what we've done at California Forward, Leon Panetta actually was the co-chair before me, and when the president picked him for the CIA, they asked me to come and take that job, and I did it on the condition that I get to be the next CIA director. But I'm not so sure. In any event, so we decided, and I'll just frame it out quickly and leave it for questions and answers, but to do 3 things. 1, put the fire out in the room. Take the paddles to the patient, if you will, and try to deal with triage, and that's the budget. This thing with IOUs and this stuff makes California look ridiculous. Just ridiculous. You know, and the number of laws that we passed that Bill Lockyer was talking about the other day, if you read the stories, he's absolutely right. So what we're going to do is, one, have a threshold of passing a budget like the United States Congress, like 47 other states, 50% plus one. But you can't do that alone. You got to have responsible counterbalancing measures. Pay as you go. Can't have a new program unless you got the money. Results-based budgeting. A 2-year budget where 1 year you do oversight, the next year you do legislation, but you change the dynamic of how it works. And basic common sense stuff that balances out so you have a thoughtful process, but you stop the noise of these stupid fights that everybody thinks anybody in government is ridiculous because they can't come to a conclusion. Second, one of the other big problems we have in California, at least in the near term, that we think strategically is important to deal with, is to stop the war between local government and state government. You know, what happens is there's not enough money, so everybody wants to rip off money from everybody else to protect their interests, and in the meantime the public says, my God, we pay our taxes, we don't care if it's to the state or the federal or the city or whatever, you guys figure it out, provide the services. In the meantime, it's a mudfest of ridiculousness. So let the local government money be protected. Begin to allow the locals, one of the restrictions is locals don't have the ability to allocate their own money. Give them the ability to do so. Let me just give you one simple example. We have a law, the Constitution says that the state has the ability to allocate these property taxes in local dollars. So in Alameda County, for example, if the Alameda County Mosquito Abatement District that gets their allocation of money says, well, you know what, we want to take that money and help spend money for H1N1 viruses. We can't do it because you can't spend the money over there. Well, let them have the flexibility to do that. It's intelligent. And thirdly, if these guys cooperate to move away from that silo word of how they all work in their own little universes, let them raise taxes for a penny of sales tax at the local level so that there can be some more money. And the reason that's the right way is Sacramento is a Politburo. No one understands, probably other than Dan Walters and 5 other people, how power really works in Sacramento. Power exists. It always exists. It's just you got to figure out who's got it and how to make it happen. And most of the people that have it ain't elected. And so the whole kind of centralized command approach in Sacramento both is antithetical to democracy and participation, and it's antithetical to the kinds of responsiveness you need to move quickly in this new globalizing economy. And the third piece is term limits, to begin to change the dynamics so we have a longer term thinking. Again, you know, at the end of the day, and I'll conclude on this, sounds like it's about 15 minutes, right? I feel like about 15 minutes. And but it's really about this. I really don't give a rat's if, is that an okay word? If, all the other stuff you said in the beginning, I guess it's okay. If we have legislators who stay in longer, if we have budgets on time, and all the noise is, and everybody's hunky-dory, if we don't produce a government that's a catalyst and a dynamic for what the next California looks like, a place that is able to compete globally, that is able to spur innovation intelligently so that and we take the risks and we take our knocks in it and ups and downs, and we continue to be the lead of where we're at. This is a serious effort from a lot of serious folks who are putting a lot of time and attention into trying to figure it out. We're not trying to solve every problem. We think the problem with initiatives is everybody tries to write statutes and regulations and kill it with details. We're at the Brown versus Board of Education level where we want to begin to change philosophy, to change and devolve power out of the state and to the local. 75% of the money that's spent is spent locally that the state spends. Change the dynamic. Bring government closer to the people. Stop the noise in Sacramento. We exist for 5 more years. We're going to participate heavily. We're doing a number of initiatives on the ballot in November 2010. When we finish that, if we're successful, we'll go to November 12, and we're going to engage in a thoughtful deliberation of dealing with the big issues and trying to make an impact on improving California, at least for our generation, and let our kids figure it out for the next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert Hertzberg. Dan Walters is a political columnist for the Sacramento Bee, having covered the state capitol since 1975. He is co-author of a new book entitled The Third House, Lobbyists, Money and Power in Sacramento. Ladies and gentlemen, Dan Walters.
Bob's impressed that he actually sees me in a suit, because I don't wear one very often in the Capitol. As I tell young reporters in the Capitol, you have to dress well enough to let you get you into the state Senate, but not well enough so people will think you're a politician or a lobbyist. And if I would wear this every day in the Capitol, they think I was a politician or a lobbyist, so I don't wear that. It falls to me to be somewhat of a contrarian. I don't really disagree with what Bob said. I really, 99% of it I could endorse very easily. I might disagree with what Ian said, because I think the history of that is a little more complicated than he put in. But nevertheless, that's quibbling. I think I want to start out with a premise. The premise is that California has become functionally ungovernable. And then the question, and it's actually, I started writing about it, something about that about 20 years ago. About finally kind of caught on, became trendy. I should become a contrarian now and go back to the Time magazine theory that everything's wonderful, I guess. But somebody put out some Kool-Aid for that fella. I don't know what happened to him. In fact, it's a great sport going on in the world press right now, as Bob indicates. People are coming to California to write the California story. Time magazine says, yeah, pretty good shape. The Economist or somebody, or Guardian had an article not too long of the British newspaper about is California going to be the first failed state? New Republic's got a long screed in their current issue about along those same lines that California is going to hell in a handbasket. But I think that the reality of it is more complex. I don't think there are any villains in this piece. I think what happened is there is a convergence of social, demographic, economic, and ultimately political currents that flowed through California over the last 30 or so years, starting about the time that Proposition 13 was passed, but there was more to it than simply Proposition 13. There was a whole series of things that began in the last half of the 70s, between 1975 and 1980 roughly, things that were set in motion that now are converging upon the state. Proposition 13 being one of those things, being one of those kind of political dynamics. But there are other things going on. It's when we start seeing the big wave of migration into California from other countries, for example. When we start experiencing the deindustrialization of the state, a massive shift in the state's economy from an industrial economy up to a post-industrial economy. The beginning of the demise of blue-collar jobs in California, for example. A lot of things happened during that period. We also started seeing a big new surge of population growth in the late 70s because we started seeing the second baby boom. It's still going on, by the way. We produce more than one baby every minute in California, more than 550,000 babies a year. And that's the major driver of our population growth, which continues to at a relatively high level despite our economic woes. So what we have here is a convergence of things, of a changing economy, shifting from an industrial economy to a post-industrial economy, with a lot of opportunity for those at the top who have education, and particularly technical education, and high-tech economy and communications, and a lot of need for low-wage, low-skilled labor at the bottom, and a declining middle class. That's the nature of this economy. So we're created in economic terms, have created, essentially a two-tier society. A much more stratified society than we saw in the 60s or even in the 70s. Completely different kind of society in that sense. Much more ethnically diverse, much more stratified in economic terms and cultural terms, much more diverse in cultural terms with an ever-widening range of cultural values. And we have experienced population growth. In the last 30 years, our population has grown by about 15 million people. And that's put pressure on public services, on schools, on parks, on social service programs, and as well as created the fuel the demand for more housing, more jobs certainly, more of everything simply by the population, more traffic on the roads. Not surprisingly, we have the most congested roadways in America. And because it's primarily an immigration-driven population growth, that is, immigration and births to immigrant mothers. We've had this tremendous cultural diversity. And this is all this is a cauldron that creates political issues by its nature. It creates challenges in education. The public education system of California that must educate an ever more diverse group of students for an ever more changing job picture on an ever declining, in relative terms, level of financing. Tremendous problems. So we once had what was generally considered to be one of the finest school systems in America, and now we are generally considered to have one of the worst school systems in America in terms of product, in terms of academic test scores and so forth, and dropout rates. Los Angeles Unified Schools, 50% of the kids that enter the 9th grade never make it through high school. It's a terrible waste, terrible, terrible waste. So we have problems. We have traffic problems. We have education problems. We obviously have a water crisis. But overarching all of this is this crisis of governance. Not only do we have these issues, but we have a chronic inability to come to grips with them. Overarching all this is this crisis of governance, this situation in which year after year after year after year, the same issues are there. And people say we're going to resolve them. It's going to be the year of education, or the year of health care, or the year of water, or the year of this, or the year of that. And nothing happens. The system is impotent, incapable of doing what politics is supposed to do, at least in theory, which is to confront the common problems of a society and resolve them. Instead, we have seen politics devolve, as Bob implied, and I'll state it more explicitly, into a kind of a tribal warfare, in which we have divided ourselves by ethnicity, by geography, by economic standing into, in the capital they call them stakeholders, which is just a nice way of saying tribes. And every issue has its tribes. And therefore politics becomes a means by which these tribes, and Bob mentioned this as well, fight over their little piece of tribal turf. It may be physical turf, it may be metaphysical turf. It may be economic turf, but they're a piece of turf. And in the end, what those in Sacramento attempt to do, and they're attempting to do it on health care and failed a few years ago, and they're attempting to do it on water today, and probably will fail, and try to do it on the budget every year and always fail, is to reconcile all of these competing demands from this extremely wide array of stakeholders, many of their demands being mutually exclusive, and they confront the underarching or the overarching flaw, as I see it, in the American system of government. Bob alluded to that, that system of government, he may have lifted this line from my speech at some point, that a small group of men who had just fought a revolution from a despotic king and were very suspicious of centralized power, if you've read the Federalist Papers and viewed the history of that, came upon the notion of checks and balances. We did not want to have anyone to have unfettered power, a king. So we would have checks and balances. We would have a legislative branch. We would have a legislative branch of two different houses. One originally elected popularly, the other elected by state legislatures, the Senate. A president, but not a popularly elected president, with an electoral college. And then, of course, a court system that evolved into something that would review what Congress had done, review what the president had done. This created hurdles, essentially. They did not, it was a system, Bill Lockyer made this point the other day at this same hearing about legislative reform, that is a system that was designed to fail. That is a system that makes it extraordinarily difficult to do anything, because it has to go through all of these hurdles, across all of these hurdles. And it's not like you get through 90% of them and you're home free. No, you have to go through 100%. If you fail one of those hurdles, it doesn't happen. We in California adopted that system in 1850 when we became a state. And the same basic structure, governor and a legislative branch, and the state senate originally represented counties, and the assembly was elected by population, and a court system. But then we went further than that. We created more hurdles, more checks and balances. Separately elected state constitutional officers like the controller and the treasurer and the superintendent of schools and the attorney general. They're not part of the governor's administration. They have their own things to do, and they're not necessarily in concert with the governor, and very often aren't. We have things like 2/3 votes on budgets and 2/3 votes on taxes. The initiative, the referendum process, more checks and balances, more ways, more hurdles to overcome. And when you combine that with this extremely diverse population, this extremely diverse economy, one with an ever-widening array of tribes, we create then what I would call hyper-democracy. Hyper-democracy in the sense that everyone has a veto power over the final product. You have to, in other words, not get a consensus, not get a majority, but you have to have unanimity. And if you lack that unanimity, those who are left out or feel left out can use these mechanisms, these hurdles, to stop anything from happening. Ultimately, if something gets through the legislature and the governor, they can go to referendum, and we saw an example of that on the last time they tried to do water, almost 30 years ago, when those who were left out of the product didn't like the product, went to the ballot via referendum and overturned the whole thing, and there hasn't been a major water decision since. Or you can go to court. Or you can pass your own initiative superseding what the legislature does, or you can just, and so on and so on. And everyone going into the negotiations over a policy issue knows that. They know they have to have unanimity. So they keep tweaking the product and tweaking it, trying to make it acceptable. They're doing that on water as we speak. Or nothing happens. If they can't get there, basically nothing happens. And that's been what's mostly. Now, it has once in a very, very blue moon, it does happen. The last time it happened was in 1996, when both houses of the legislature voted unanimously for an energy deregulation bill. It had gone through all the stakeholders, all the tribes. They had all given blessing because they had all gotten something out of the deal. The legislature didn't stop to say, hey, will this thing really work? What's the worst case scenario? What's the downside risk? Nobody wanted to ask that question because everybody had signed off on it. And we're told that it was win-win for everyone. Well, we know what happened, right? Turned out to be one of the greatest disasters in California history, costing many billions of dollars. Ian alluded to that and said it was Enron. Said it was more than Enron. Yeah, Enron was there. But the legislature did this, thinking they were going to improve on a deregulation plan that was being done by the PUC. I won't even get into it. So it was known, by the way, as the Steve Peace Death March for the legislator who put it all together. So we're left then with two choices when making policy for California. Either nothing, which has been what's happening on water, for example, or transportation, education, or a monstrosity that's unworkable. Because by the time you tweak it to satisfy everyone, you've created something that just can't work, like energy deregulation, or like most of the state budgets. It is absolutely impossible to pass a budget that is rational. The only budget that can be passed in Sacramento is one that is imbalanced, because you can't satisfy the demands of the Republicans for lower taxes or no tax increases, and demands for the Democrats for more spending or no spending cuts. And the only way you can get by that every year is to basically run an unbalanced budget and try to get somebody, and then use a bunch of gimmicks and whatnot to get through the year. So there's a fundamental flaw. We are testing the limits of the American system of government to work when the society it serves reaches a certain level of social economic and cultural complexity. A system designed by white male landowners for white male landowners. I'm not sure they were all Protestants, though. White male landowners. Most of them certainly were. Who assumed that only white male landowners were ever going to vote. For an agrarian society, very sparsely populated, served its needs at that time, but as we're finding in California, that theory of government, the idea of old moldable checks and balances, simply does not work when applied to a society as complex as this one. Not only doesn't work, can't work. And therefore the question is, how do you change it? Well, obviously, efforts are underway. Obviously, it's been recognized that California is dysfunctional. Even the Chief Justice says so it must be true. Bob's California Forward is one effort, although I note parenthetically that Leon Panetta decided that running the CIA and fighting Al Qaeda was easier than reforming California. The other one, the rival, friendly rivals, I know, sometimes friendly, sometimes not so friendly, is another effort mounted by the Bay Area Council, a group of corporate CEOs in the San Francisco Bay Area who visited Sacramento last year trying to press their issues, as local groups often do, and were appalled that the Capitol was totally paralyzed in the budget and could not even deal with anything else. And from that, came to the conclusion that what California needed was a constitutional convention. A kind of a one-shot deal, rather than the incremental approach that California Forward has been pressing, a one-shot, do-it-all-at-one-time situation. And so they will tomorrow file their own initiatives, numbers 79 and 78 or 79 or whatever, to put two measures on the ballot next year. One of those measures would allow voters to call a constitutional convention, one of which we have not had one, oh, that's a great convoluted sentence, since 1879, 130 years ago. Because now, under current constitutional law, only the legislature can call a constitutional convention after asking an advisory from the voters whether they should do so or not. Actually, the voters voted in the 1930s to have one, and the legislature refused to call it. The second measure would call that convention, and I don't know the wording of the thing, it's going to be filed tomorrow. They've been really struggling with the wording, to try to limit that convention to issues of governance and try to avoid its becoming involved with abortion or gay marriage or some social issues that would kind of blow up. It's difficult to say whether either of these efforts will be successful. In part because the very conditions that make California so difficult to govern, perhaps impossible to govern, are just the complexity of the state, may also make it impossible to reform the state. But what's the alternative? The alternative is to continue down the path of balkanization, in which California then merely becomes a collection of tribes, defined, as I said before, by geography or ethnicity, economic standing. And politics devolves further into a system by which rival tribes do battle for pieces of to protect their turf, but the state ceases to have any kind of community or sense of community or common purpose. So I personally applaud the efforts at reform. I'm not, however, terribly sanguine about its chances for success. I think we are at that moment, to use the cliche, a crossroads in California. And we either learn to govern ourselves effectively or deal with the consequences of failure. It's fascinating. It's exciting. I mean, certainly the efforts have sparked an enormous amount of academic interest. Practically, this is just one of almost countless numbers of seminars and forums and whatnot devoted to the subject. There's a book being produced about the whole constitutional crisis of California. I know because I wrote a chapter of it. It'll be out in the spring. Academic papers, the political science people are just salivating over this whole idea of some grand experiment in government reform. But of course, predictably, the contending ideological forces on the right and the left are already out there pushing their own nostrums. The left wants to screw the right, and the right wants to screw the left. So the question is whether this whole reform effort then becomes simply another battleground that ends in a no decision, or whether California can indeed, in its own enlightened self-interest, muster reform. I think there should be basically two principles to the reform, to the structural reform. One, empowering those we elect to office to make decisions without having to go through so many hoops, cross so many hurdles. But secondly, and equally important, holding them accountable for those decisions. We have a system now in which decisions aren't made and everyone passes the buck for the failure. We need authority and accountability if we are to make the kind of decisions, whether it's on transportation, education, water, or dozens of other subjects that we need as a state to progress through the 21st century successfully. Or we'll just become, as we already are becoming, a laughingstock, a global laughingstock of the California that had all of this going for it and frittered it away. Thank you very much.
Well, Dan, there was something that Bob said that was very tantalizing when he referred to the power structure in Sacramento as a Politburo, and he said that it's difficult to find where the power centers are and who really wields the power, but it is wielded by a few people, and most of them are not elected. And then he suggested that maybe you were the one that could divine that mysterious, unwind that mysterious plot.
I think really the truth of it is there's not much power in Sacramento. I think there's a lot of latent power there, but it's a very passive sort of place. It's a place in which everybody's playing defensive ball most of the time. Truly, state government has a lot of latent power. It can shape the state and how it builds its highways, where it invests its money and all sorts of things. But it's not a power that's really used, because so much of the energy, whether it's bureaucratic energy or the energy of lobbyists, the energy of legislators, is really spent in the defensive mode, in protecting turf. Because there's such a great suspicion, suspicion that somebody else is trying to do me in, that there's very little. And you think about political campaigns and how they've been waged, and how the dialogue has evolved over the years from elect me and I will do X for you and for my constituents or the state, or from that to elect me and I will protect you against whatever the threat du jour happens to be, whether it's environmental despoiling, or whether it's crime, or whether it's taxes. So the whole dialogue of politics has changed from a positive to a negative, to an appeal to the fears of those who, of their voters, against whatever threat seems to be most saleable at that particular moment in time. And so the whole place has become this kind of defensive, negative place as opposed to an offensive, positive place. And I've seen that evolve. I mean, I literally have seen that happen in the last 35 years, because when I came to the Capitol in 1975, there was still it was a place where you had the sense of there were things to be done there. There was accomplishments to be made. There were a lot of disagreements, there were a lot of fights, but there was a kind of positive looking sense. And I've seen that whole thing turn around to a negative sense in the 35 years.
And Bob, after listening to Dan's eloquent description of the dysfunction and the layers of dysfunction and the way that he really unpacked that gridlock, I wonder how you're going to succeed reforming that system. And on the surface, it would seem that the rival initiative to start with a blank sheet of paper, so that you don't get trapped in that the other system, is the only way you're going to change the system. But he also pointed out the caveats that, they could bring every social issue like abortion and anti-gay stuff could, pack it and paralyze it.
Look, I mean, I think Dan's observations were pretty on the money about what the challenges are and what the consequences are of our current situation. What I've been focused on, like a laser beam, is the solution. And just like he talked about the framing of the Constitution of this country at its foundation, trying to deal with a despotic king and checks and balances and the like, I ask the same questions of really backing up at what I always like to talk about, the tectonic plates of power. I think most of the folks in politics, as Dan correctly articulates, are amateurs in the sense that they are just playing defensive. They wouldn't have an original idea if you couldn't find it with a search warrant. And they're not really thinking through a vision of what it looks like. I have great fodder as kind of a fellow who's been around for 37 years when these young candidates come in and like to beat them to the ground when they come up with these ridiculous theories about what they're going to do, and ask them the hard questions about how the system really works, and tell me about what the state's going to look like in 2025 and what are you going to do to get it there. To ask really the tough questions instead of just, oh, here's $1,000 and be my friend or whatever. I don't really care. I'm not looking for friends. I'm looking for ideas. And so with that in mind, look, you're correct, and let me just kind of articulate it both in the context of what we're doing and why I think there's challenges, although I applaud the democracy part of the Constitutional Convention, but why I think there's challenges with the convention. First, what are the elements of success? What do we need to do? We need to have a democracy that is inclusive, because that's who we are. We need to have a place that is responsive to the globalization to be able to respond quickly. Devolution, and folks won't send money to Sacramento, to Washington, or to the moon, right? But they will spend money in their own backyard because they can touch it and feel it and see it. We need states to build the broader structure, and we need the states to ensure that there's equity and fairness in the process. But what we really need to do is to devolve things in communities. And look, local governments have a lot of problems, and we need to change their constituencies. But you need to create places where there's a sense of scale, where there's a sense of place, where things aren't so big that they could be manipulated out of control, that someone could write a check for a few $1 million and buy a system. I proposed the system in Los Angeles of boroughs where each council person represented 70,000 people. We have in Encino, out in the San Fernando Valley where I live, folks that claim to be leaders of the Encino this group and Encino that group, when I've never seen the groups exist, and the papers quote them. And it's easy to manipulate if somebody's rich to be able to do that. But if you're some local person, like you go to the San Gabriel Valley, you can't do those kinds of things. The fundamental foundation of the scale of democracy just doesn't work in California. The largest city in America at the time of the founding of the Constitution was 31,000 people, which was Philadelphia. So this scale creates the ability to obfuscate the truth, to scam and to play the games and to tear apart the democracy. And it also creates an ability where people feel that that nothing that they spend money on actually affects them or does things. And it's a situation where you have the young Latina who's elected to the school board, and yet she can't do anything because everything happens up in this ethereal place called Sacramento, when she now seeks to represent her community and can't be responsive. That's what I mean about it being a Politburo. The devolution of power is a way that celebrates both the diversity on the one hand and the need to be agile in a globalizing economy on the other, and to compete with different corners of the state and make the place work. Now, there's more to that, and there's some questions it raises, which I just don't have time to answer. On the Constitutional Convention, what concerns me is that in this new world order, time has a different dimension. We don't have time to deliberate the way we like to deliberate. First, I'm not persuaded that you can call both a convention at the same time you create the power at the same time. That'll be challenged. Second, I'm not persuaded that we won't see declaratory relief actions as to what the focus of that constitutional convention was going to be. As Bob Stern in his speeches eloquently talked about, the 1879 convention was all about the 86,000 Chinese that came here involuntarily, and what are we going to do about the Chinese problem? You're going to see, Dan, abortion and gay rights and immigration and on that. And so what's going to happen is the effort to try to solve it in this big place won't work, in my judgment, in the near term. And then secondly, so you've got all these horrible stories. The press will love to write about them, but all of that's going to tear apart the California brand. And look, I'm not an incrementalist. I'm a gigantic idea guy. I love the gigantic ideas. It's very hard to hold me back from doing the gigantic stuff. But I just think, you think deliberatively for a moment about this, you have this very sensitive democracy. You have this tribalism to which Dan refers, and he's exactly correct about that and how it plays out. But I do think that there is a road, given the fact that all of this thermonuclear activity is coming up on the ballot. Labor's coming up with things like split roll property tax and oil severance tax and tobacco tax and clawback tax loopholes and stuff. Businesses coming up with caps on the government to stop it, and the right is doing that, and the pension issue and paycheck protection so that unions can't collect money without a vote of everybody in the union to support a particular candidate. And that'll spend everybody's money. And so what's happened is they had that war in 75, 76, and 77, the initiatives in 95 or whatever it was. And what I found is I'm running around talking to folks, even the most ardent people are nervous. They don't want the war again. It doesn't buy them anything. They'll spend a few $100 million and they'll beat each other back, but what's going to happen? The electorate's in a very difficult position, a different position than they were some few years ago. And there is some patriotism. There is some statesmanship of folks that are willing to stand down. Will it happen? I don't know. But it is, as Dan says, worth the effort. And it is extremely complex, and it is very treacherous, but I don't know any other way to get there. And I think having Irvine, James Irvine, and Haas, and the California Endowment, and Hewlett and Packard giving us $30 million to be able to start the process to make sure that we're there sends the message to the moneyed community that we're not going away, that our approach is completely bipartisan, everything's Democrat and Republicans. It is very difficult to craft a vision. At the same time, you're trying to weave the tribes. But I do think there's a way to do it, and you know what? We'll see. We'll see if it works.
Well, just a quick question then to Dan, and then I think we should go to Q&A. You mentioned in your talk, Dan, that the state is becoming a two-tiered rich, poor, without a middle class. Now, that seems to be also...
A declining middle class.
Declining middle class. Well, that's the trajectory. But that also, I think, is reflected at the national level, and lots of people have pointed that out, and indeed Warren Buffett recently warned that we're in danger of becoming a plantation economy. So how different are we from the federal situation? And surely the federal situation will be the one that has to take on this American problem, or is there anything that can be done at the state level to reverse what appears to be a national trend?
We in California love wretched excess, as you've noticed. And in that regard, we also in wretched excess. We have the wealthiest of the wealthy, the poorest of the poor. The extremes are much more apparent in California than in most places. And part of that is an ethnic complex. I wrote a book about California 24 years ago, I guess it came out. And making that exact point, that we would devolve into a kind of a two-tier society of a Asian and white overclass and a black and Latino underclass. And it's coming to pass. And it's coming to pass more probably for global reasons than, as you imply, more for global reasons, changes in the global economy. But we have not taken the steps as a state to try to compensate for that, to try to reverse it. Our education system, which is where you deal with things like that, for example, has been woefully inadequate. We're failing. Literally millions of children are not getting educated in this state for any kind of employment, much less employment in a technology economy. So while they're mostly, it's kind of a global thing. My theory is that since California is on the edge of the continent and we have all these global impacts on California far in excess of those on other states, both in terms of immigration and commerce and whatnot, that California is kind of becoming like the rest of the world more than the rest of the United States. And the rest of the world is not a particularly egalitarian place, as you might have noticed. And there's more distinct classes. And California is becoming that as well. And then this segues into the political arena in the sense that there is absolutely no relationship between the population of California and the voting population of California. Just in ethnic terms, for example, whites are something less than 50% of the population now. Latinos are well over a third. Asians are another 12% or so. Blacks maybe 7%. That's the gross numbers. But so even in those terms, it's very distinct. Whites are still 70% of voters. Asians are maybe 3 or 4% of voters. Latinos maybe 12, 13, 14% of voters. Depends on the election. Depends on what turnout. But there's a great disparity just in ethnic terms. Then you put it in economic terms. The vast majority of voters are homeowners, for example. And yet we have one of the lowest home ownership rates in the country. About 50-50 between renters and homeowners, but 75% of voters are homeowners. The vast majority of voters have post-high school educations. And, I think most interestingly, and probably most tellingly, voters are an aging bloc because the white population's aging, and most voters, the vast majority of voters are white, it's also an aging bloc. The median age of the California voter is somewhat north of 50. The median age of all Californians is down like 30. Now, of course, you have the kids can't vote, you understand, that's part of the thing. But you have an aging electorate and a declining electorate in proportionate to our population. We have one of the lowest voting records of any state in the United States. It's pretty abysmal when you think about it. I mean, particularly in local elections, that Bob talks about local government, the turnout in local elections is practically nil. I mean, what, 20% in the last city election in Los Angeles or something like that?
It was less.
Yeah.
It was less. The second council district, I mean, no, Bob, you know what it is? It was almost nothing.
So you have
14,000 people.
So the stratification of society that's so evident in economic terms and education terms is also evident in political terms. I mean, it imposes a great burden on the political system. One of the many reasons why it's not very effective is that people seeking office in California have to appeal to one block of the population to get elected, which is not representative of the block that they're going to be governing or serving. And there's a constant struggle, a constant tension between, do I do what my voters would prefer, or do I do what my constituents need?
And the third element is the people that write checks.
And then the people who write checks.
Which is the third constituency that probably has the most power.
And so you have,
talking about the fundraisers?
all of these are impediments to effective decision making.
The people who've put money in politics.
Yeah, it's money. It's all money. It's always the money. I mean, you know, people look at, like in the state legislative example, where you know, people say it's partisanship. Hocus pocus. It ain't partisanship. It's money. One of the biggest bills that I had opposition to when I was stupid enough to get myself involved in it, not knowing, of course, thinking about public policy, not thinking about politics, was a bill where we had a prison where it was cost like $100,000 a cell to produce, and we were making it for women who weren't a big threat. So I said, let's take the women, we'll put them out and privatize in some low security deal, and let's use that facility for men so we don't have to build another prison.
Prison Guards Union really liked that, didn't
Oh
they?
boy, let me tell you something. The prison guards, you all think that the labor is labor, right? Well, let me tell you, a 3-hour debate on the floor. They beat me to the ground. Everybody was beating me up were Republicans. Why? Because the prison guards support Republicans for office. It wasn't a labor versus whatever. Kurt Pringle, who had lost for Speaker and was the leader on the other side that year in 1997, was leading the charge to take us down because he was getting money for those guys. Once they get elected in a term-limited environment, nobody worries about getting taken out. You worry about what you got to say to get elected. They get elected, then they don't worry about what they got to say because they only worry about where the money is so they can get to their next office. Money has the biggest influence of all. I mean, Bob's been saying this for 30 years. It just is. It just is.
Yeah, I mean, the power structure in Sacramento looks nothing like the power structure of society.
No.
I mean, it's a completely different kind of situation. I think it's Carrie McWilliams, is that the right name?
Carrie McWilliams, yeah.
Carrie McWilliams described Sacramento once as a bazaar.
It is.
And he said we're fishermen and farmers and so forth. Well, you just take out the fishermen and the farmers and put in labor unions and insurance companies and so forth, and Indian gambling tribes, whatnot. It's the same sort of thing. It's a bazaar. It's an arena in which people come to do battle over money. One of the things you have to remember about Sacramento is that however imperfectly it operates, it has enormous influence over money. So money is spent on politics. I once calculated that the state of California, that is the legislature, in terms of the budget, the governor, his appointees, other constitutional officers and everything, basically control about $400 billion a year. About half of that's in the state budget, including federal funds. The rest of it are things like utility rates,
Right.
insurance premiums, and so forth, not counting the indirect consequences of somebody getting to build a football stadium in the city of industry, for example, things like that. You can't even quantify those things, but in direct terms, the quantifiable terms might be $400 billion
Think about the
a
PUC
year.
is like $75 billion.
And so there is enormous amount of money. That's what the focus of the place is who gets what out of this thing. Whether the insurance rates go up, whether they go down, whether this is shifted over here, not shifted over there. You're going to be voting on that next year on the ballot, as a matter of fact. So that's what it's all about. And so money gets spent in politics. But remember, as much money is spent in politics, the stakes involved in the decision-making are about 1,000 to 1. So Bob's right. Money is a huge determinator of what goes on in Sacramento and is one of those impediments to effective decision-making, but it's not the only one. I mean, you could clean up the money situation. You
Can I
still have a
just
dysfunctional
one
legislature.
anecdotal story? I was a young lawyer in 1980, I think, or 81, and we were trying to. We found that I was involved with a client where the Catalina Island Company had the rights through the Lands Commission. Oh, there's that Lieutenant Governor thing again. The Lands Commission around Catalina, I think they were paying like $7,000 a year, and they were charging like $80,000 for each one of the moorings. And so Ken Corey puts it out for bid. We go and we look like we might win the bid, and they hired Judge Garibaldi, a famous figure, who just introduces legislation that just steps on us. The details aren't important, but it was so much easier and less expensive to just introduce a law. Ultimately, I think the island company paid $125,000 a year, and it went up. It's a great company, no quarrel with them, but it just shows how the system works. And for me, it was eye-opening as a young lawyer. It's like, oh my God, you think you're going to win something, and they do a head fake on you, and they go over to the legislature, and for 2 cents on the dollar, they get a much better deal.
Here comes the judge, Judge Garibaldi.
He was a famous guy.
The late Judge Garibaldi, James Garibaldi, former state legislator from the Central Valley, former judge, was the chief lobbyist for many years for the horse racing industry and the liquor industry. And he was also, and more interestingly, I think, and most people don't even know this, his lobbying practice was an adjunct of Pat Brown's law firm in Los Angeles.
That I never knew.
You were going up against Pat Brown, so you were really
he
going up
phased
against
me.
And
Didn't know that.
Well, let's get this conversation going with the audience here. We have microphones on both sides, I believe. We do, yeah.
What means do we have to change the stranglehold that the prison union has on the state of California?
I don't think they have that stranglehold anymore, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, it's
They've
different.
fallen on hard times.
Right.
Well, you like him or don't like him, Arnold Schwarzenegger's not been the pushover for the prison
No.
prison guards union that his
Right.
predecessors were. He has hung tough against them. He's public
right.
enemy number one as far as they're concerned. He's tried to modify the sweetheart contracts that Gray Davis gave them. He has tried to put in prison reforms that would reduce the costs. Let me give you a little idea of what we're talking about in costs. The amount of money California spends on prisons has doubled in the last 10 years, from about $5 billion to $10 billion. The costs about $45,000 a year to keep an inmate in state prison. 50 now? Okay, well, it's gone up. If we were spending the same proportion of our budget as other major states were spending, it would be about $6 billion a year. Or to put it another way, we have about 160,000 inmates. Texas has about 150,000 inmates. Texas spends about $3 billion a year. We spend $10 billion a year. So, and that money primarily goes to the prison guards because it's a salary-driven situation. And the contract that they have is, or had at least, was Byzantine and the complexity. It basically gave over running of the prisons to the prison guards union for all intents and purposes.
Down here in front, this is our resident fact checker here. Wait a sec. Wait for the mic. Wait for the mic.
Yeah, I think that Florida and Texas spend about 17 or 18,000 total on their prisoners. We spend 17,000 per prisoner in health care alone. So if you want some good health care, get in prison. Yeah,
and it's considered substandard by the federal courts.
Yeah, I
Right.
think we're going to be letting out, what, 30,000 next year? 30,000 will be on the
Something like
streets?
Something like that. It was 174,000 I thought we had in the system, I thought.
Yeah, and 1 out of 4 is actually an undocumented person, too. So that's another interesting tidbit. That's according to Chief, LA County Chief Lee Baca. This goes right to sanctuary cities. I spoke with Mayor Newsom a few weeks ago, and he is very proud of his sanctuary city program that he runs television commercials for in San Francisco. And he fully is proud to bring that, to make sure it's a statewide policy to give every government service to anyone who can get into California. And that is probably our next governor. And
No,
this is,
it's
well,
probably
let's put
not
it this
the
way,
next governor.
I don't think so.
he's working hard, and that's one of the agenda items. And I think our mayor in Los Angeles was a few years ago down there. We do your toilets with 500,000 people downtown. Today we march, tomorrow we vote. So sanctuary cities in San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco have been a regular pattern over this 20 years. And I think you said it. You talked about the cauldron of immigrants and their huge families. Quote unquote.
Well,
Wait a minute, that's a bit of a
let's
severe
be clear
characterization.
here.
We're inviting them.
Immigrants, even illegal immigrants, are not California's problem. They really aren't. They're not our financial problem. They have a certain effect on society, both positive and negative. They supply a lot of labor for a lot of businesses. They pay taxes.
Right.
Do they pay as much taxes as they consume? More or less the same, according to any data that you want to look at.
Right.
But they're not what's driving California into the dumps, as many people think. They are part of California, but we have more serious problems of governance than immigration or illegal immigration. It's a big hot button thing for people to push, and radio talk show people and everything. It's really, in real terms, it's not that big a deal.
Right.
The lady here in front. No. Down here in front.
Part of the simple question, but I'm European, and it seems that there could be irrational decisions that governments make. For example, you are in solar industry, and one of Bill McKibben's suggestions was, why doesn't every California roof have solar panels? Another thing that I was in the Bahamas, and every roof in the Bahamas has a system to collect rainwater in the basement. And so my question to you is, would you like to discuss a little bit the water problems in California? And my question to you is, why can government make these simple, rational, common sense decisions?
Well, it's simple. There's nothing simple about California, no matter what you think. No matter what you may think. It's just nothing simple about the state. The water, real fast, because this is something you could go on for hours and hours and hours. California is not Nevada. It's not Arizona. California actually has a lot of water. About 200 million acre-feet of water flow through California every year in terms of rain and snow melt and so forth. Human use of that, total human use, agriculture, non-agriculture, is in the neighborhood of 40 million acre-feet. Non-agricultural human use, drinking water, water lawns, industrial, commercial, it's about 9 or 10 million acre-feet. So we're not talking about a water shortage per se. What we're talking about is a political problem, not a hydrological problem. A political problem in terms of storing and conveying and pricing that water. And plus, it is the underlying issue of water is not water, it is land use. And the battle over water in California,
right.
the political battle over water in California, is mostly a battle over land use, and because land use is tied to water. So it's more of a political problem than it is a hydrological one. We have water in this state, a lot of water. The question is how we price it, distribute it, and so forth. And it's, if you would let engineers and environmentalists solve the water problem, it could be solved very easily. But unfortunately, it's a political problem. And then you get into politics of land use and politics of this and that and the other, and a lot of tribal warfare over water rights and that sort of thing. But it's not an insoluble problem in technical terms. It's an insoluble problem only in political terms.
Yeah, let me just add, if I could, just add a little more dimension to that. What? Bermuda, yeah. But the notion also is that Southern California, when you look at, just doesn't have a lot of innate water that if we capture the runoff and the like. I mean, there's some, obviously, groundwater and the like, but the part of that political problems to which Mr. Walters referred is we're taking water from the north, right? And so they're saying, wait a minute, what do we want to, there's these big political fights between the north and the south that Democrats and Republicans of the north hang together against Democrats and Republicans from the south. Same thing happens with the farmers at the Colorado River who have the beneficial use to that water, and they call us the coastals and say how much we waste water and the like. So it goes to this larger issue of just the orders of magnitude of how big California is and the complexity of dealing with these challenges by its size and the fact that we're moving 600,000 acre-feet of water for San Diego, LA County and how it works and the like. I mean, we have to move water from all these other folks. It's just wildly complex. But that being said, the truth of the matter is that when you look at the water system and the genius of those folks, Bill Mulholland, Bill Hilgard, right over here, the folks that were part of the genius of creating the Los Angeles system, it works pretty well. The state of California, all this energy crisis that was referred to earlier, the city of Los Angeles made $900 million profit on the energy crisis because they had surplus energy. They also have done.
They didn't buy into deregulation, though.
Well, they weren't. No, the municipal utilities weren't affected by deregulation, but only investor-owned utilities. So that's Edison and PG&E and Sempra. Now, the second question was on the renewable energy. Yeah, I got to tell you something. It drives me nuts, right? I mean, here I am. I leave government. This is a story. It actually was one of the factors in why I decided to run for mayor of Los Angeles a few years ago. I was really taken aback by the weaving that had been done by the utilities in writing the law. So when we tried to deal with, I was speaker during the energy crisis that cost us $45 billion, by the way, I was just gripped by how screwed up it is. So if you wanted to put solar on roofs, or if you wanted to have distributed generation or a generator in the basement of this building or whatever, you couldn't do it. You couldn't sell it in. You couldn't use your roof power. I mean, it was incredible how brilliant they were of weaving all these prohibitions in the system. And so I started a solar company in Los Angeles on Martin Luther King Boulevard, trying to do the right thing. And you know what happens is I built my machines in Germany, and as I brought the machinery here, the day that I brought it, the city says, oops, no more subsidy program, we made a mistake. So I had to tear up all my contracts that were based upon subsidies because there wasn't economic intelligence based upon the plan. And ultimately the company turned out to be successful. We went public on the Alternative Investment Exchange in the UK and won the Wall Street Journal Award for Innovation in 2005. But it's unbelievable, and it remains the only solar company in Los Angeles, this great cauldron of innovation. And I went to Wales, not because they offered me one penny, not a penny, but because the system, threats of the Russians, as you know, the cost of energy, a whole host of other reasons, and they had the financial infrastructure to deal with us, to go and do business over there and build a factory in Cardiff, Wales, that I had never been to, as I said, in my whole life. And what's going on now is, I mean, even this whole discussion about renewable portfolio standards, to me, you know, is crazy. I mean, it's just nuts. It misses the point. If you're going to incentivize a conversion from a fossil fuel industry to an alternative industry, it's about money. It's about incentivizing capital to come here. Companies from all over the planet, whether it is Bermuda or whether it's the electric motorcycle company in Shenzhen, China, where they don't have any internal combustion motorcycles, or whether it's the huge amount of wind in Ulaanbaatar in Inner Mongolia. I can give you examples all around the world of great companies that are doing phenomenal things that aren't here. We're doing the R&D stage of things, and we haven't figured out how to really do the economic side of bringing those great ideas here. We're still very, when you look at how many megawatts of power we generate, just to give you some sense, the United States of America last year maybe produced 550 megawatts of power, the average size of a power plant in photovoltaic cells. China did 5.1 gigawatts, 11 times that number. You know, there's no brand loyalty to energy. People are buying miles. People are buying light power, or whatever it may be. As long as it's convenient, reliable, safe, and equally priced, people will buy green. There's a lot of money in it, and I'm shocked by how impotent we have been in the whole green space, despite all the noise and all the fancy stuff we have out there in the green stuff. It's pretty dismal because we haven't gotten it. We're still tied up in, we're California and we're great, but we haven't really turned the corner. And it really is pretty painful. Business too. I mean, business has been pretty weak on this stuff. They invest in R&D and say we're green, or there's a few demo projects, but it really isn't the dimension of, you know, the Maldives, 100% renewable portfolio standards. Go down the list around the world of what's been done. Czech Republic, Bulgaria, fabulous stuff that they've done compared to us. It's not just about Spain with their wind turbines and stuff like that. So it is pretty painful, and we're way behind it. I'm nervous about it. And by the way, I don't do business in California.
Lady here with her arm up, the blue sweater.
Hastings.
I just have a question sort of towards what Mr. Walter says about authority. If you go to Sacramento, all around the Capitol, there's the high-rises that are full of lobbyists. So I was hoping that you can touch on how you then give them authority with the premise that there are lobbyists with the money to sort of influence the assembly members or the state senators, knowing that even before they get to office, sometimes they're setting up meetings with the lobbyists who can sway them one way or the other and make them more accountable to the people. And then I'm wondering if you can comment on how your organization, California Forward, would do something about the influence of lobbyists.
Well, I think the issue, I mean, Dan's right about the authority, but I think the characterization is wrong. I don't think anybody really exercises authority, whether it's in the private sector or not, in really an intelligent way. There's a few people that do. Most people cut and run and cover and try to figure out ways to avoid it. You know, I used to talk about in politics about what I call the thermonuclear theory of politics. If there's a thermonuclear device in the middle of the city and you're really a great leader, what you're going to do is to quietly figure out how to de-detonate that device. But what politicians do is, and they're incentivized in the current system to do this, is to not let anybody know you know anything about it, let it blow up, run in with the mask on, don't get any sleep, and act like a hero. Because if you go and you take the detonator out in politics and you took this great risk and no one ever knew about it, you're not a hero, and you can't run around and brag about it. If you take it and you pull the thing and it blows up, you're the poor bastard who blew up the city, right? And you tried to solve a problem. There's no incentive. It's like in baseball. You swing at the ball 1,000 and you bat 800 out of 1,000. You're the greatest ball player in the world. But in today's world, they'll find one of those wild swings and they'll say, that guy Walters couldn't hit the broadside of the barn, because they take the photograph of that. They spend all the money. They don't talk about the fact that you hit 800 of 1,000 times, but the one time you took a wild swing, they then tell that story because so politicians are not incentivized to take the swing, to take the authority. And it's the same thing like middle management in companies. I don't want to just hit politicians because I'm trying to do innovation around the world. I'm dealing with all these dweeby middle managers in companies that are doing the exact same thing of trying to cut and run and hide. What you got to do is you got to embarrass them. You got to trap them. You got to put them in a position where where I put greater authority on, greater accountability, greater emphasis on the word accountability. Create a structure that you can't play that game. And that's the idea of local involvement, where people know who you are. They know what the truth is. You can't make it up, right? The idea of oversight, where you incentivize politicians to ask the tough questions because they get in the paper or get press reports when they're doing the hard work, versus writing a new bill that says, you know, we're going to have the Make You Skinny and Cure Cancer and Let You Stay Old, you know, Grow Old Act. So all the press people go out and write a story about that. You gotta take the noise out of it, and the accountability isn't by virtue of giving them authority, because the game gets played where everybody plays the show game. It's really creating an environment where they can't escape, and they have to make a decision. And that, I don't say that because I'm a cynic. I say that because, you know, great systems of democracy work on human nature. And you have to understand it. And folks that are in tough positions, wherever they are, don't want to be embarrassed. They don't want to make these tough decisions. They want the accolades, to have the cameras and say, I'm great and blah, blah, blah. They want to deal with impression management. But really, it is about making the tough decisions. And guess what? You screw up sometimes. My staff told me when I was in the energy crisis, don't meet with Ken Lay. I met with the guy. I didn't know who the cockroach was, but I was going to talk to anybody I could. They said, stay out of the game. Don't get involved, because this governor will take the risk. I said, I'm sorry, I didn't get elected to be a Putzberger to sit in the sidelines. If it means I never get elected anything again, I'll take the risk. But you don't, the risk factor in every game. So most people don't do it. They're not in political life to take the risk. They're in political life to have everybody think they're great. And risk means that you blow up sometimes. It means that that bomb blows up. So you got to put them in a situation where you force them to take the risk, and that taking the risk is a less risk than the embarrassment you're going to have by not de-detonating that bomb, because everybody's going to know it. And it's structural of how you do that.
Bob's friend Gray Davis found out that he's probably the most risk-averse politician in the world has ever seen.
And look what happened to him.
And he found out that the riskiest thing of all is to avoid risk.
Yeah, but when I was in those meetings with the governor, I'm sorry, this governor's not going to raise taxes. I'm sorry, we're not going to raise taxes, right? Because he was so worried about it. You're right. But he got to be governor by being risk-aversive, right? And all these other guys are all risk-aversive. Very few people are going to get out there.
And that's why I'm kind of fascinated by the possibilities of throwing out this checks and balances system of government we have and going to something like a parliamentary system.
That's interesting.
In which, you know, whether it's certainly not an undemocratic system. It's used in England and Canada and a lot of other places. But the one great virtue of it, as I see, is that whoever is the head of parliamentary government has to have a legislative majority by its nature of the system, has no way of passing the buck. They are empowered to act virtually by decree, as long as they retain their parliamentary majority. True. And they're held responsible for the outcome of that act. They can't. And I'll give you an example of it in California. Who's in charge of public education in California? Can anybody say? You can't, because there is no one in charge of public education in California. The governor has a piece, his education secretary, the superintendent of schools, the state school board, the county school board, the county superintendent, the local school board, the local superintendent, the teachers union. When anything good happens, which is almost never, they all, you know, yeah, we did it. As Bob says, they wanted the accolades. If anything bad happens, it's the other guy over there. Not my problem. I'm not responsible for that.
Walter's made a mistake.
So there's no authority to deal with public education because it's so amorphous, it's scattered so much, and there's no accountability for the outcome because you can pass the buck. And that's why I'm kind of intrigued with the idea of a parliamentary system, because it could embrace the diversity of California with 4 or 5 or 6 political parties, because I don't think you can stuff the diversity of California into 2 political parties, as witnessed by the large growth in independent voters. Right. And you fight those battles out to get that parliamentary majority, to create that coalition, if you didn't have an outright majority. And once you've done it, once you have formed the government, you have to act. You cannot then pass the buck. The governor can't blame the legislature. The legislature can't blame the governor. The assembly can't blame the Senate. The Senate can't blame the assembly. The parliamentary head of government is empowered to act and held accountable for those actions. And I think it would be a better system for a place like California.
The question is this. I used to say this. What was it, the 5th largest economy in the world or the 8th largest economy in the world?
We used to be 5th, and then the exchange rate changed. Now we're 8th.
Okay, 8th. All right, so are we the 5th largest economy in the world, or are we broke? Pick one. When I was entering UCLA in the fall of '81, it cost about $202 a quarter, I think it was, to go to UCLA. That's what my dad was paying back then. So which are we? Are we 8th or are we broke?
We're both. We're both the 8th largest economy of the world, and the state of California, the state government, is broke, as a matter of fact. It's functionally insolvent. It can't actually go bankrupt, but it probably would if it could. But it's functionally insolvent. And let me tell you the dimensions of that just to scare you a little bit. Right now, the state of California has a baseline general fund revenue of about $75 billion a year. It's temporarily boosted up to $85 billion by those temporary tax increases that were enacted in February. The baseline spending budget, what we're committed supposedly to spend, is about $110 billion a year. So that's about $35 billion out of whack. And to make it even worse, 1/4 of all those revenues to support the state of California come from 1% of taxpayers. The wealthiest 1%, 144,000 taxpayers out of 38 million people supply 1/4 of all the money for state government. Over half of all, or about half of all the income taxes, and the income taxes are about half of the total thing. We are utterly dependent then on how well a handful of wealthy people are doing in the stock market, because most of their income comes from capital gains and other capital activities, stock market and other capital activities. That's dangerous. I don't have any sympathy for these people. They can take care of themselves. But it's dangerous for the state to be so reliant upon a handful, literally a handful of wealthy people. But to change that, we would have to either broaden the sales tax out to services, good luck on that, or even more perilously from a political standpoint, broaden the income tax into more middle income ranks. Neither of those would be very popular, as we found out, as Gerald Parsky's found out recently. But we are just into this thing where we're just on this precipice at any time on how well a handful of wealthy people are doing in the capital markets. That's dangerous. We should not allow that to be. We should have a broader tax system of some kind, because it's just perilous. And we have a spending side of the ledger that cannot be easily adjusted to that. So we have the revenues going up like this, up and down, and the spending is locked in at a certain rate, and we have deficits every single year. Even when the economy is doing well, we have deficits. It's a mess. The next governor of California will walk in the door, whoever it may be, whether it's Jerry Brown or Meg Whitman or whoever it might be, and they're going to have this big pile of stinking stuff on their desk. Those temporary tax increases will have expired. The temporary spending deferrals will have expired. All the little gimmicks will have expired. The gimmicks are getting more bizarre every year, like counting the June 2010 state payroll in July instead of June, so it folds into another fiscal year. I mean, this is bizarre, and robbing local governments. And you cannot overstate the dimensions of California's fiscal mess. We have the worst credit rating of any state in the United States. We have become the laughingstock. Last week they had this hearing on government reform, and one of the speakers, it didn't get much media attention because Bill Lockyer was sucking all the air out of the room, was a fellow from the National Association of State Finance Officials. Boy, there's a dull bunch of people, right? And he went through all the things that other states have done to stabilize their finances. All the things that they've done in these other states. He ticked them off. This state's done this state's done that. Things like rainy day funds, like making long-range spending projections, like long-range revenue projections. In other words, try to look beyond just the next minute, just getting through the next day with another gimmick. And it struck me that every single one of the things that he mentioned had been proposed in California at one time or another. And every single one of them had been ignored. And so we have done none of those things. Now, one of the things that California Forward wants to bring some sanity to that, like 2-year budgets and pay-go and things like that. That's just scratching the surface. Right. You cannot overstate the mess. And what will that mean? Inevitably, it's going to mean higher fees in colleges. It's inevitably going to mean continued relatively low levels of financing for the public schools. It's going to continue to mean added pressure for prison spending. You can't get there from here. And we kid ourselves year after year. And this is the failing of the political system. This is what this kind of system produces, is a state budget year after year after year that's full of gimmicks. We talked about Enron. All the things they went to jail for in the collapse of Enron. Overstating assets, understating liabilities, hiding things on the budget. These people went to jail. That is everyday procedure in Sacramento. Why is it unacceptable for Enron and acceptable in the state of California? I have no idea. It's just considered politics. It's just, hey, there's a little gnome. There are gnomes in some little room in the Capitol who all they do is dream up budget gimmicks. And they put them on a shelf. And then one of the masters comes down and says, well, we need $1 billion gimmick. The guy says, got one here for you. It's called, we'll just put in another $1 billion from the federal government. How do you know you're going to get it? Well, we don't know where they're going to get it. We'll just put it in on the revenue side, and, you know. Or $1 billion from selling the state compensation insurance fund. That's one that's in this year's budget. Well, are you going to sell it? Well, we don't know, but it gets us through the day because we can add another $1 billion to the revenue side of the ledger. This is what people went to jail for in the Enron thing, and we accept this as everyday activity in Sacramento.
Well, let's take a last question here. The gentleman with his hand up. Wait for the mic. He's coming.
I just wondered, maybe Mr. Walters could answer the question best. Who are you writing for? Has the audience changed for you over the last 10, 20 years as we've lacked camera crews and TV crews in Sacramento for some time? How bright is the audience? Well, we're whipping politicians. How much of the responsibility is ours?
How much of the responsibility what?
Is ours.
Is ours? Well, I don't know if the audience has changed very much. I don't pay attention to what the audience is. I just write my column every day. But, you know, if I wake up in the morning, my column's in the newspaper, I'm still employed, that's all I care about. But if it's not in the paper, then I start worrying. Fortunately, it's been in the paper 7,500 times, so I guess I'm still okay. But it's there. I write about it. Other people write about it. If we ignore this crisis of governance in Sacramento, it's not because we haven't been told. We've been told this was coming. You've been told it's coming, if you pay attention. It's nothing that's just sprung up overnight. It's something that has evolved. If I ever write another book about California politics, it's going to be called Unintended Consequences. Yeah. It's the result of unintended consequences of demographic change, economic change, political decisions, all interacting with one another to create consequences that nobody could foretell, or at least they didn't try very hard to foretell. There are no villains in it. It's what happens when a society evolves in a certain way and the governmental structure does not evolve with it and becomes anti-ethical to the society. Unrealistic, totally disconnected from the reality of what society is. And yes, the voters are impartially to blame. They keep voting for these cockamamie things that show up on the ballot, full of promises. Well, vote for this and it'll be wonderful. And it's free money. It's not going to cost you anything to get $3 billion into stem cell research or $10 billion for a bullet train, and boy, it's just going to be wonderful, and it's not going to cost you anything because it doesn't raise your taxes. No, it just takes a bunch of money out of the budget to repay those bonds that we can't afford because we're already running deficits.
We can't get credit.
We do that sort of thing. And so, yes, you as voters are partially responsible for this thing.
Well, I tell you, Dan, one of the most depressing things that Dan said tonight was how the people in this state who could benefit most from getting into the electoral process are not into the electoral process, and the people that already are benefiting are the ones that dominate the electoral process. As a politician, or a recovering politician, do you have any clue on that?
Yeah, and it also goes to the homeownership issue that Dan talked about. I actually grappled with that. It really bothers me. I mean, I think like in a corporation, you have to have a quorum for a shareholders meeting or a board of directors. Otherwise, there's no legitimacy. The meeting's not legal, right? I think there should be a quorum for an election. Otherwise, the election's not legitimate. And part of the reason is these you've got so many things in your life, this blizzard of activity of taking care of everything you got to deal with. It's hard to remember to think about this stuff. The campaigns used to start really 30 days in advance, and at that point in time, if you moved and you had an apartment and tried to re-register, you couldn't register because you had to register 30 days in advance. I tried to do same-day voting. I figure you can buy a car on the internet, you can do all this other stuff. Why can't you do a same-day voting and have a technology that protects against fraud in the system and make sure you deal with it appropriately? Successful in getting the governor to change the law to make it 15 days. And just in Los Angeles in 2001, 67,000 more people turned out to vote who registered in that window. The system is designed, and quite frankly, to be very candid, political consultants of both the Democrat and Republican Party do everything they can to try to disenfranchise folks because they want predictability within the electorate that they're trying to send mailers to or whatever. They want to be able to count those folks, know exactly how they're going to perform, and predict the outcome of the elections. So they were big fighters against increasing the group. Gray Davis told me, "Oh, it concerns me because we're going to get the factor like we had in Minnesota where we had a wrestler get elected because a bunch of kids turned out in the last day." Well, welcome to democracy, right? We're afraid of it. So the answers to so yes, it's a really big problem, and it's something I think that we need to talk about in California Forward as soon as we deal with what we're dealing with now to create a greater nexus between the election and the electorate and those who participate and in the system. But 15 days is better, same-day registration. There's a number of things that we can do from a policy perspective that in, Costa Rica, you go to your hometown and 98% of the people turn out. I was talking to somebody yesterday, Minnesota's in the high 80s in their turnout, and we're horrible. Part of it is people move here. They're not connected to their communities. They move a lot more. There's a lot of I was born in Los Angeles, but how many people in the audience were and are connected to what's going on, the size of our local governments? There's a bunch of reasons for it. And but I completely agree that it is foundational to the health of this democracy, and we've got to tackle it in a serious way.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's thank our guests tonight. They've been very stimulating.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan.